Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse. This episode was recorded in late November 2021.
Under a nearly full moon, the Syria crashed against a reef in the South Pacific Ocean in 1884. When I close my eyes, I can almost see her, this grey and white sailing ship rolling and pitching, surrounded by an angry sea. 540 souls on board.
Most of the people on the ship couldn't swim, and some saw land in the distance.
Hello and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by the Bangalore International Centre. I'm Srikrishna, and our guests today are Mary Rose Abraham and Gayathri Vaidyanathan, co-creators and hosts of the Scrolls and Leaves podcast. Mary Rose Abraham is a writer and independent multimedia journalist. She was born and raised in Los Angeles and worked as a longtime producer and reporter at TV and radio networks in the US. Gayathri Vaidyanathan is a Canadian journalist of Indian origin who writes about science and environment. Her magazine and audio work has appeared in Nature, the New York Times, the BBC, and other places. The Scrolls and Leaves podcast is a labor of love for Mary Rose and Gayathri as they meander through little-known tales from history, science, and cultures and look for alternative ways of knowing and contextualizing our present. Season 1 of Scrolls and Leaves, titled Trade Winds, came out a month ago. It's set in the Indian Ocean world, and the narratives over 7 episodes weave interviews with historians and extensive research in archival. The highlight, of course, is the fact that the podcast uses 3D sound and allows for a beautiful, immersive experience. Today, we chat with Mary Rose and Gayathri to learn more about Scrolls and Leaves and the fascinating journey of making the podcast itself. Mary Rose and Gayathri, welcome to BIC Talks. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Sri Krishna. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you, Sri Krishna.
I'd like to focus our conversation on a few different things, but we'll start, of course, with the podcast itself. Gayathri, tell us the story behind the story and how did Scrolls and Leaves really come about?
So this started out before the pandemic in 2020. So there is actually a third co-founder of the podcast who is Venkat Srinivasan, the archivist at the National Center for Biological Sciences. And Venkat and I, we sort of knew each other and we wanted to create something to do with sound. And Mary Rose and I also knew each other. We're all alumni of Columbia University's journalism program. So we had this sort of shared passion around storytelling and sound. Mary Rose has many years of broadcast experience, and I also have interest in audio. So we had this shared interest, and we thought there wasn't sort of a podcast that was narrative, that had great sound design at that time. I have to say in 2021, there have been some incredible podcasts coming out. So, but back then that was sort of what got us started. So I remember all of us sort of met at this at this restaurant in central Bangalore, just a week before the pandemic started, trying to plot it out and conceptualize the podcast as stories, telling stories from the margins.
This is Scrolls and Leaves, a podcast featuring stories from the margins of history, science, and cultures. Please wear your headphones to listen in 3D sound. 2,000 years ago, on the southwest coast of India is an ancient port that's at the heart of global trade. In this land called Muziris, the ocean roars like drums. There's more grain than people need. It's cosmopolitan. People from 40 different cultures live here.
Both Gayathri and myself, having grown up abroad, myself in the US and Gayathri in Canada, certainly, in those spaces, your education, just the air is saturated with the stories of the majority. And at this point, the majority is, of course, the the Western world, the white world, to put it bluntly. And so, those are the things that we always learned. It's only now that we're seeing this incredible movement around the world to have the voices of, folks that were colonized, folks that have always been sort of on the sidelines, and their stories are not being told. And of course, there are so many layers within that. I mean, you can take race. For us, that's like, telling the stories of brown people, and non-white people. Certainly, I mean, in India, of course, the caste question is a big one. That is a harder one for us to do. We want representation from underrepresented communities. And while we can do what we can to tell those stories, perhaps those are best told by folks from those groups. But it's a very general feeling of anyone whose story has not been, heard enough. And we're excited to be part of this very small, like a small part of this big movement around the world. And I think why now is because we are seeing this everywhere. We're seeing it from a gender perspective. More stories of women, LGBTQ communities, and we're seeing it from all the other social groups, of people who have not been, their story has not been told. So that's what we're hoping to do with respect to margins.
Understood. And it would be great if you could walk us through, sort of at the high level, what goes into making each of these episodes, and then we'll jump into perhaps interesting stories or anecdotes that you've come across as you've been making each of the 4 episodes, and I know the 5th one just came out a few hours ago. So what's the storyboard like? How did you, where did it all start off? And how is it all sort of come together? And maybe I would love to hear from each of you on this as you got going. And maybe I'll start with asking Gayathri that.
Sure. So I think for us, the first step was sort of conceptualizing what the first season should be about. And as Mary Rose said, initially we started out thinking of this very much as decolonializing histories. And there was an exhibit at the archives space that spoke about the Silk Route and this immense trade across the Silk Route and around the Indian Ocean. And that's kind of where we got this idea that there was so much happening in this part of the world that led to the current global order. And that just doesn't get told. These stories don't get told. And very much a lot of what we hear about the present day is sort of, it's kind of, the present is narrated using the histories of the West. So that's kind of the framework we came with, that we wanted to tell the stories from this part of the world. And the first season, therefore, is called Trade Winds, after the winds that kind of helped with the movement of boats across the waters in olden times. So boats would catch the monsoon winds, and that was how people got from the west to the east. So that's kind of where this high level conceptualization of season 1 came in. And so from there, we sort of had to go into particular episodes. We started off with production of firstly 2 pilots, just as a proof of concept. We had, thankfully, we had some people who were very interested in us and gave us some funding to put this out. And so that came out in August of 2020. And Mary Rose, what do you think happened after that?
Yeah, definitely that's a concept. And then putting that into practice is just so many steps. The first thing was, within that large framework of Trade Winds, which probably contains 1 million+ stories, is to choose the ones that we want to tell. And we definitely wanted to span a large thing of history, from the early, like 2,000 years ago, all the way up almost to the present day. And so that was definitely behind choosing some of the stories. We wanted to make sure it represented, a large portion of South Asia. And of course, borders have changed, but we do hope that, it represents like a large section of the countries that are now in South Asia. And so finding the stories was a fun process, actually. I think both of us really enjoy research. You can go down rabbit holes starting to read journal articles and books and a lot of times just speaking with someone who is an expert or not an expert and just has an interest in something. And of course, we also had stories that sort of were kept in our back pocket that we'd always wanted to explore. And so the three of us got onto a call, and we talked out all the stories, and central to all of them, and some of them we knocked out because they have to have a narrative. So it's great to have characters, it's great to have, this like maybe tidbit from history, but if there's no like beginning, middle, and end, then it's not doable. So because the focus of our whole podcast is narrative, telling a good story, keeping the listener engaged. So once we chose those, it was a question of an incredible amount of, research, finding sources from all over the place. And mind you, we're doing all this from home. There was no running to the library or even, any sort of like on the ground research.
Yeah, and this was all through COVID as well. And that was something that I did want to talk about as well. But sorry, keep going.
Sure. Yeah, all the COVID sort of challenges that a lot of people had to face, we also faced that. I was lucky for our first episode on the search for Muziris, an ancient port. We had a little in-between break between our lockdowns, and I made a quick trip to Kerala, and that was our sort of only on the ground set of interviews and things. But yeah, for the most part, everything was done from home. And so going back, so we did all our research, figured out who were the experts to talk about this. And I don't know, Gayathri, do you want to talk about sort of how we choose the people that we interview? I think that's an interesting sort of thing to look at.
Yeah, and also what struck me was, how easy or hard is it to find people, and especially when you're trying to do a lot of this, from home, and may not necessarily, have resources available on ground in different places, sort of go and look for people. So that was something that struck me as well. And so maybe as you walk us through that, Gayathri, talking about, how easy or hard is to find some of these sources and historians would also be helpful.
Sure. So it is always challenging to find the right source because, or the right person to tell the story through. I think some of that goes into that research process that Mary Rose said, and as she said, the narrative is super important. And by narrative, it's like you need to hear someone's tale that kind of pulls at your heart, so relate to the listeners at an emotional level. So typically when we're looking for the right people, it's we're looking for someone who's able to tell a story, who is directly also connected to the story. Like, for example, Mary Rose, when she went to Muziris, she spoke to the person who's been heading that excavation. So the story is almost unfolded through him as the main character or the vehicle for that story. And for the episode that just released this week, or today actually, which is on indentured labor and the saga of it, and it's the story of a historian named Brij Lal, and it's an incredible story. Brij Lal is just a very soothing character. I mean, he's an amazing person, historian, world-renowned historian, but in terms of the narrative itself, he's just soothing because he has a soothing quality of voice. He's kind of philosophical, and he's an older gentleman. So connecting with him was actually quite challenging. I had, before I reached out to him, I had read his books. So he had done like a lot of sort of autobiographical work and also lots of stuff throughout his entire career. But this is not someone who necessarily lives on social media or checks his email or leaves like a very easily traceable digital footprint. So I had to reach out to other historians in Australia who might know him and then just ask around about who would know him. And then they kind of reached out to him. And after like many weeks, I got this email from Bridge, and I was thrilled because it was like finally after that sort of hunt, I'd managed to reach him. And it was wonderful because I spent like, I was actually in Canada at the time and he was in Australia. So it was like a night and day difference. So I remember just sitting up all night chatting with him, and it was just so wonderful. And I think some of his character would come through in the audio, I think, if you listen to the episode. The other person in that episode is Umit Bali, who's a stand-up comedian in Australia. And again, like very difficult to reach him. I had to stalk him on Facebook, reach out to other stand-up comedians in Australia, and they kind of connected me to him, but then he only ever talks on the phone. So that was like an international phone call interview. So yeah, these things get very, very challenging.
Each episode tells a story set on the Indian Ocean as global civilizations connect with South Asia. This was once the thriving heart of global trade. We'll start in Mysores and visit the excavations, attempting to locate it in modern-day Kerala.
Then we'll travel to the 17th century, to the wilds of Persia and Afghanistan, where King aspires to establish a dynasty that spans all of Asia.
Onward then to northwest India in the 1800s, where a fierce Sikh dynasty stands as the final bulwark against the British. We contemplate the power of rhetoric and science to spread empire.
Right. And how did the thought process behind sort of wanting to do this in 3D and then how did all that really fall in place, Mary Rose?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And 3D is certainly one of our signature sort of callings for the podcast. This is something that we were connected with an incredible sound designer, Nikhil Nagaraj, based in Bangalore. He is the person who told us, I think that this is a podcast that would be especially effective in 3D sound. And of course, I can speak for myself. I had no idea what that was. You have a vague concept, based on 3D, but he really, gave us a sense of the spatial aspect of it, just how it surrounds you. The old term is probably surround sound, but it's more than that. And then the more we got to know about 3D sound, it's like, the purpose of these narratives is to place you within the story and history, not just as an outside observer. And 3D sound is what makes that possible. So you really feel like, when the murderer is putting his sword into the victim, you are right, there. So I think, and then again, like from the Mysores episode is where, on the river, traveling to the large Roman ships, you can feel yourself on this rocky boat surrounded by goods that are going to be traded, pepper, black pepper, and other precious items. And then, the wind in your face, all these things. They're lovely.
Yeah, it is really a movie-like experience in that sense.
Yeah, and it's incredible that, all that can be done without picture. And even more powerful because your brain is creating the picture. So that's 3D sound. So again, that played into how we write. Everything is connected here. We have to write in a way that the sound was foremost. So you want to make sure that you.
I would have never thought of that. Tell us more.
Yeah. So obviously in a narrative, you want vivid description. You want something that will capture, as Gayathri said, the emotions of the listener. But when you're adding in an audio element, in particular 3D sound, you have to write so that Nikhil knows what to put in there to augment the words. And
so it's the tone of the writing that drives then the kind of sound that that Nikhil picks up. Would that be fair to? Would that be a fair statement? Interesting.
And
okay.
when well done, which we tried, not always succeeded, but tried, can't make it obvious, right? Can't say, oh, the door opened with a soft blah, blah, blah. I mean, he can do that part. Instead of that, we'd say, like, Mohan entered the room. And then you will hear the door and you know that Mohan has entered the room. And so that's the magic that he, captured for us, and that we hope that the listener is really transported to these spaces and scenes.
And do journalism schools train students on things like this, or maybe they should start doing that?
It's been a few years since I was in Columbia's journalism school. I'm going to guess that they have really kept up with all these things. But yeah, of course, a large part of journalism is learning something new every day. And within audio, within video, any medium, there's always something new to learn. And as technology advances, as concepts and ways of telling stories advances. Yeah.
And as these episodes start to fall in place and the themes emerge, then is there almost how does the soundscape sort of get formed? Are you able to see that at a broader episode level, or what does that look like, Gayathri?
Well, like Mary Rose mentioned, it actually starts very early, like right in the scripting itself. So when we script, we think of the sound and we write it, keeping like sound notes in there. And then at some point, Nikhil also jumps into the script and we go through the script with him and get feedback on what kind of sound would be good. And we don't want it to be very on the nose ever, which I hope we achieve. So like, for example, if you're talking about China, we don't necessarily want like some like very stereotypical music from China. Because, but then what Nikhil does is he takes this music and then he kind of distorts it, makes it, because he's very skilled in electronic music and synth and all that. So he just does some kind of magic to it. He kind of transforms it. And the amazing thing about Nikhil, like beyond the spatial audio part of it, is he's just an incredibly talented composer. So all the music on our show is entirely composed by him. None of that is canned. And he's entirely self-taught. So he didn't go to school for music composition. So I'm just like incredibly in awe of his talent. So yeah, it's very collaborative.
Yeah, and the fact that this is all original in that sense is really something. And
the other thing to mention is even the sound effects that are there. Like, for example, in Pandemics and Borders, there's a scene about cholera where this doctor goes into this hut and there's a man dying from cholera. And there's also like this dirge that comes in when bodies are thrown into the Ganges. So that's like a moment when history repeats, right? Like we've seen some of that with COVID. And then in that scene, Nikhil introduces the sound of a dirge. And that's something that he actually did capture in Calcutta because he just loves to capture sounds in the field. So a lot of the sound effects that you would hear on the podcast is not canned, but actually from real life. So yeah, he's incredibly talented. And it is sort of like a collaboration. So he comes back to us with the sound, and then we go back and forth, give feedback, make suggestions, and and at the end, we end up with the episode. At some point, we're like, yeah, magic. I mean, what he does is magic. So
interesting. And I think the other thing that stood out for me is also the artwork. I think just the fact that the imagery is very evocative, and even though one is, I realize that with podcasts, it doesn't necessarily play that much of a role, but the fact that you've given it that thought and it it is something that strikes the listener. I was curious how has that thought process played out, and what's that been like? Maybe I'll ask Mary Rose to respond.
So our artwork, we love our artwork. We love the colors, and we hope that they
even the fonts actually.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So again, this is a very talented person that we collaborated with, Samia Singh. And she, we told her what we wanted. We're trying to evoke sort of, I guess, the artwork and pictures from yesteryear. And this this font is very sort of the old school type of writing. That beautiful calligraphy that a lot of artwork that we see now. And the boat and the people on it all, actually ties in directly with our first season. It is trade winds, it is trade, it is, on the monsoon winds traveling to far continents. And so that was also important. I think the idea behind the artwork in general is just it kind of strikes you immediately as something old, something from history. And so that's sort of how that came about.
And I think I also was intrigued by the world upside down, or I was curious, is there a story behind that? The map of the world with the south and the north interchanged.
Oh yeah, that's the equal Earth projection, it's called. So the whole idea, like where we started out from, was we wanted to tell histories from the other part of the world, the histories that are not getting told. And we initially, like before we settled on stories from the margins, we had this idea of stories from the global south, but these terms are just so loaded and problematic and have such negative connotations. So these days we use the term majority world because that's where 80% of the world of people live. But yeah, the map kind of reorients that global south, like puts the south in the north, kind of an idea. And then it's also drawn true to size because most projections of the world are not true to size. So nations assume their sort of actual importance on the global order. So that's kind of what we asked Samia Singh to do, and she delivered a beautiful, beautiful drawing.
It is, yeah, it is. So what's the reception been like, Gayathri? What are your listeners saying, and what are you hearing?
The reception's been great, I guess. When we launched, it's incredibly difficult, first off, in podcasting, because podcasting is entirely about word of mouth, and we are a very small team. It's essentially Mary Rose and myself, and we get some help through the archives, of course, and Nikhil, of course, is there on sound, but it's like such a small team compared to these big outfits that are out there, and they have a lot of marketing budget, and marketing matters because that's how you get the podcast in front of people. For us, it's like so word of mouth. So anytime we hear back from people, we're just really immensely glad that they heard us. And there've been like some lovely comments. Like I remember one person wrote in and said she usually listens to podcasts to help with her running, but that day she ran in order to listen to our podcast. It was like, wow, we must be doing something right. But we hope we can improve.
Yeah, and I did see someone else had also talked about the experience being just like the IMAX, which is actually something that resonated for me as well as I was listening to the episode. So it really is your signature, and it really stands out. And I was curious if you've had interesting anecdotes or stories that haven't made it to the podcast, but through the time when you've been researching. Or through this process, or fun stories that perhaps you might have, and I'll maybe ask Mary Rose to take that one.
Do you mean like things that we had to toss out while scripting, or more like production type things that happened to us?
I think it's more the production type things, and also because you mentioned that this the idea and all of this came through, or just started you got going with it just before the pandemic. So obviously a lot of all the work that you've done has been through this time. So I'm guessing there must be, those challenges are interesting to share as well. And I'm sure
Oh yeah, sure,
makes for good
yeah.
stories. So maybe starting with that.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I know one thing. I to this day I do this because we are a small team and we have to be very careful of the money we're spending. I mean, a lot of it is from our pockets. So studio time is expensive, and so you kind of look around your house and see where can I find a quiet space. And I have to say, in my neighborhood, at least, that is a hard thing to do. That dogs barking, honking, people yelling, it's a lot of fun. So a lot of times it's me getting up at 4 a.m. for that really early morning quiet, or staying up super late. And I love the way that we record. Also, is that I mean, for myself, like I have like a built-in wardrobe in my bedroom, and so I literally open the door and I climb into it. And sit on a ledge where I remove my clothes, and then I still have like kind of a lot of like dresses and skirts and whatever hanging around me, and this is my soundproofing. And so
Yeah. So
so I'm sitting, yeah.
you weren't. I mean, I do remember listening to one of your podcasts where you told Gayatri that I'm in my closet. You
Yes.
weren't lying that time.
No, I was not. No. This is the. I mean, we hope it's a seamless listening experience for our listeners, but really, this is what's happening behind the scenes. We're sitting in the dark in our closets, and recording, and you're juggling a few things in your hand. You've got your recorder, and then you've got your phone with the script, and it's just there's a lot going on there. And of course, you have to make sure you don't touch a wire and make it rustle. So it is challenging, but it's also kind of funny. I've always wanted to take a photo of myself in that closet recording because I just think it's so funny to, this is how the magic happens, in this like very dark wardrobe. So yeah.
And I think this is also, part of what it takes to build indie podcasts at some level. I think it's this sort of hustle and the scrappiness that one is doing, because clearly there are no large production budgets, and one sort of just rolls along with everything and with whatever comes our way. I'm curious, how do you see that evolving in general as as a space? I mean, podcasting's been around now for maybe 15 years, and it's only now where it's sort of more recently, there is the moment in the sun. It's starting to become far more popular than what it was before, and particularly with some of the larger production houses and people getting into it. But I think bulk of what's out there is smaller and independent podcasts. How do you see the space evolving, and what does that how do you see things changing for folks like yourselves as in terms of your own journey? I'd love to hear from both of you on this one. Maybe I'll ask Gayathri to start.
Sure. So I think there are two different podcasting spaces that we kind of think of ourselves in. One is sort of like the global podcasting space, which is dominated by US and UK, just Europe. And it's very, very mature, like very dominated by big productions, and to get any sort of traction as an indie podcast on the global market is tough. So we actually saw the other day that we were, Good Pods is this platform that really supports indie podcasters, and we saw we're like, it's also a global platform. So we saw we were fairly high up on the list, which was great. So that is like really nice. In India, it's a lot more exciting right now, I think. And maybe Mary Rose would agree with me because, as you said, lots of independent podcasters, but also a lot of investment in podcasting from the big players, from Spotify to Apple,
and Amazon as well now, I think.
Yeah. So, and we didn't quite know, like when we got into it, we found it very difficult to understand what the industry was like. We are not from sort of like that Bombay studio production house background. We come from journalism. So to understand the industry was quite tough here. It's not quite as analogous to what is there abroad. So I can't say we still fully understand it, But in terms of the indie space, lots of people coming out with great content, some really funny, incredible hosts. And I just hope people can find a way to make money out of this like they have abroad, because what's happening here does not seem very fair to me.
And Mary Rose, do you see people reaching out to you after this and sort of, looking for, hey, how could I get going, or looking for nuggets from your own journey, and what's the sort of response that you might have for
think,
folks like those?
I haven't personally had anyone come to me and be like, hey, I want to start a podcast, but yeah, for anyone who might be listening and thinking about that, have at it. Yes, the space is crowded, but as Gayathri said, India is exciting right now. It has that freshness that is, in my opinion, completely lost in the Western world, particularly the US. There's just too much. But in India, there's so much that needs to be done, and programming around all sorts of issues that don't really get covered. And what's the best way to start? I mean, yeah, I think, seeking out like programs that you like, maybe getting in touch with the hosts or the producers and seeing what they do. I mean, the technology is such now that, if you kind of just go online and type in how to start a podcast, there's so many resources. You don't need a big fat studio. You don't need a big fat microphone. Like it's all been sort of like brought down to every person's level. And so there is space and everyone needs to tell their story. Let it be crowded, let there be choice, and let people have their voice. That being said, it is, as Gayathri said, a very tough market. If you're looking to make money out of this, it's not going to happen. At least not for some time.
Well, it won't happen soon, right? Yeah.
No. This is truly, as you said, Srikrishna, at the beginning, it's a labor of love. And it really is. There's a lot of labor. But the love is what keeps it going. And, I remember, I think I was randomly looking through Apple Podcasts or something, and just for fun, I typed in Indian or India just to see the number of podcasts. And I noticed, well, there's tons, which is great. But I also noticed that there were a lot that started in that sort of March, April space last year during the beginning of lockdown. And then you saw 1 or 2 episodes and then it was gone. So that happens, and that's fine. But
staying at it and being consistent.
Yeah, consistency is very important. Once your listeners are captured, the only way to keep them hooked is to keep delivering content, and keep your space active. So yeah, but I would encourage anyone, even if you don't have audio experience or even writing experience, just start. If you have the good idea and you have what you want to talk about, you can begin. A lot of resources out there to help.
True, but I think it does take that effort and maybe just keeping at it to be able to build the storytelling ability there, because ultimately that's what gets the listener hooked as well, which clearly in your case, Scrolls and Leaves, I think that's just it seems to me at least that you've got that really right from the get-go, and these are really interesting stories, and one hasn't heard as much, while one might have come across some of these nuggets, or as a broad one's heard about the Kohinoor, one knows about the plague back then, etc. But I think what stood out for me was the fact that the level of depth into the storytelling, I think, is really fresh and new. I think the other thing that also, and going back to your point, Mary Rose, on you're able to do this with lower budgets. I think that's seeing a change as well, perhaps, and I wonder if you'll agree that one is able to achieve reasonably high levels of production quality, even at moderate budgets, and be able to pull things off from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, technology has made that possible. And there's a lot that we can do. I mean, you have to get. I mean, we are audio journalists, but there was still a lot that we had to get trained up on. To particularly in the editing programs that we use, to make sure that we could capture that sort of complexity that could be done by a team of people, and that is something that is forced upon you when you're a small team. If you're the only person or 2 people you do most of it, which is good and bad. It's a lot of time, but it's also something that you can carry forward and be proud of, that you were able to create something from start to finish and present it to the world, and hopefully people like it. Yeah.
So 5 episodes from season 1 are out. 2 more to go. What's in store at Scrolls and Leaves? What does the next year look like, Gayatri?
Right now we are sort of taking a breather to assess just how this season is doing. So one thing about season 1 is we kind of approached it as journalists do, which is we sort of decided what stories we would find interesting to tell. And we sort of thought this is what people might find most interesting and pick those. But going forward, we'd like to have more of a back and forth and pick a second season that would really resonate with our listeners. And what shape that would take and such, we're still yet to figure it out. But yeah, I think second season will be very exciting, and the format of it might be different, just based on feedback from people about length of episode and things like that. So yeah. And I just want to address one point that you made, or maybe slightly disagree with both of you about whether it is possible to have something of this production quality on a lower budget. And I personally think the three of us are sort of undervaluing our work, because we are not, because the budget should be higher than what it is, for sure. It's just how the creative arts are, I guess, in that there isn't funding. And I think that's a shame. There should be more funding to enable people to do things at a high level of creativity, to explore and push boundaries, whether in storytelling or sound. Because that's kind of the passion, right? The reason Mary Rose and I have stuck with it for so long and didn't drop off after 2 episodes is we're truly passionate about it. And we're passionate about the storytelling, the sound, the crafting of the episodes, the talking to the people. And we are living and breathing this thing, even to the extent of handling social media and learning these skills. But I think all this should come with a higher production budget. So yeah, it is possible to do it. But I don't think in other economies, such a production would be done at such a lower level of funding. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I see your point. I think it's really around not being valued for what it really is, and I see what you're saying.
I know there's some great podcasters in India who are literally making these amazing podcasts and not getting paid for making the content, which blows my mind, because content is king, and it is the person sitting there doing the research, putting the story out, who should be making money out of it, and not someone else who packages it and distributes it, in my opinion. So
yeah, can I just add something there, if you don't mind, Srikrishna? Yeah, I absolutely agree with Gayatri. I mean, I do believe everyone has a right to tell their story, but getting to our level of production is very challenging. And if you look at the podcasting space, I don't know the exact number, but I'm going to say a high 90-something% is your very basic, interview style. And that's the easiest form to do. You don't have to do much editing, just kind of talk, and that's it. But what we're doing is,
this podcast would sort of fall into that bucket,
right? No, there is a need for these types of things, but I'm just saying that the narrative podcast, the storytelling podcast, is the highest form of podcasting. And so, I would advise anyone don't jump into that first, because you want to work your way up to that. And yeah, I think what Gayatri said was right. We are undervaluing all the work that we have put into this. And there is something to be said about, how much can we have done, compared to what I think a corporate studio would throw probably 15, 20 people into this kind of production. Yeah.
No, and I think what also stands out is the depth of research that is going into making what you're doing. I think there again it would be it isn't in the 90%, right? I think the 90%, like you're saying, is relatively straightforward. Not to take away from what people are doing, but I think there's still a long way to go when it comes to being able to see podcasts where there is a fair degree of depth and research that's going in. Because and maybe that's also comes with that journalistic view, with a view with the lens that one's putting on as a journalist, perhaps.
Yeah, I think the journalism aspect is really important, and I'm glad you noted that. Both of us have this very strong background in journalism. We truly believe that you can't play with the facts. They are what they are, and as we're creating these narratives, it has to be in service of that. We have been able to stretch a little bit and used a lot of research material to create fictionalized accounts, but we are very clear to note those and to label those as fictionalized accounts, so the listener knows there are facts behind this, but we have taken some leeway with the description and how something plays out. But journalism is at the heart of this podcast.
And I think just overall, where we all are in India and the rest of the world, there's just so much information, and the boundaries between what is real and what is fake is so blurry, and it's difficult to judge these days. So trust is very, very important, and that's something that we want to really stress, and that we want to be absolutely transparent about our sourcing, and also not kind of perhaps pick topics that are very just kind of play to our present moment of just divisions that we are sensing, but kind of goes above that and tells universal stories of like belonging and search for something. So kind of goes a step above, and also kind of helps people sort of leave that behind, like that daily chaos of the news cycle behind, and kind of just come to listen and get immersed in something, and maybe come away with some understanding of the world that kind of transcends the confusion of the everyday that we are all living in, maybe thanks to the internet, I don't know.
True, and at least for me, it leaves. I think listening to Scrolls and Leaves, I think leaves you with a lot more to think about, and like you're saying, it does help with taking you to a time where a lot of it is, of course, your own imagination, and it's not fueled by what you look around you, and to me that is very powerful. So on that note, congrats again, and thank you for doing what you do, and looking forward to the next season and more seasons. And at some point, I do hope that while it continues to be a labor of love, there's also a lot more that you're gaining from it, just in terms of the real value that each of you would want to see coming through. Thank you for joining us, Mary Rose and Gayathri, on BIC Talks. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, Srikrishna.
Thank you, Srikrishna, and thank you also to BIC for being such a great partner for us. It's just great to have help getting the word out.
Thanks again, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.